And this is Ed, and as you can see, I'm in the newsroom, global HR business. That's what it's all about. We have global HR this and that, but this show's about business. And with us today, very distinguished guest, Dr. Emily Yarrow from England. Welcome, Dr. Yarrow.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Ed, for inviting me along today.
Yes, we've met on LinkedIn, and here we are. Wow.
Yes,
That's a tribute to trust and exploration, and then making the plunge to be on global
absolutely.
TV. Stephen Howard, welcome. Thank you for your time. Stephen Howard is very, very busy these days. He's just published his 27th book. And why don't you tell us about how much time that took you to go from 23 to 27? It's been all this year, I believe, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a bit of cheat code in there, Ed, in that two of the books I actually started writing last year and pretty much finished them. I was going to publish three books in a series and then got sidelined on these my two Humany books. So I decided, well, I've got those two books written. I might as well finish them up and publish them. So I launched a series called The Art of Great Leadership with just two volumes instead of the three I had planned. So but yeah, they've all come out. We've published one, two, three, four, five books this year so far in 2024.
Well, that's great. I'm going to ask you to display whatever you want in slides in a few minutes. Um, Dr. Ken Lloyd, longtime friend and of about a year, but a long time meaning he's been on like 20 shows or so. It's amazing. And each one is more intelligent because of your involvement, frankly. So tell us about what you're working on right now. Tell the audience about that.
Yeah, right now, sort of like Stephen Howard, I'm working on another book. I'll have a new one coming out in December, a Dummies book through Wiley Publishing. It's a updated edition of my first book on performance appraisals and phrases for dummies. A lot has happened in performance appraisals over 15 years, so I did a complete rewrite and update of that book. And now working on another one, trying basically to identify some of the factors that clutter our thinking and interfere with our decision making, and how to remove those and replace them with more productive approaches to problem solving. So that is very much in that stage, as well as doing some basically career coaching and guidance along the way with various individuals and at their various organizations.
So in Dr. Ken Lloyd's background, he's connected with Hollywood to a large extent, meaning media and not acting. This is all real. There's no acting here. So when you were writing the advice columns, you didn't have AI, but you had a system of rolling all that stuff out because that's a real time consuming thing, I would imagine.
Yeah, that was great fun. For 20 years, I had a workplace advice column. And for 10 of those years, it was syndicated by the New York Times Syndicate. And basically, people would write in and ask people-oriented questions at work. It would not be a technical question on which program to use or how to code this or that, but rather dealing with people situations. My manager ignores me. I'm getting no respect from my coworkers. Our company allows bullies to, that type of thing. I really enjoyed that, and it was fun. And I tried to put some interesting aspects and not make the answers, if you will, academic or stuffy or highfalutin, but rather here's some hands-on advice. So that type of writing I actually enjoyed. Over the years, though, as newspaper columns changed, and certainly we see much more of this out on the web, the World Wide Web, and the internet and all. The column gradually switched over to my writing them far less often these days, and not through any particular organizations or syndicates, but rather on my own. But yeah, I always enjoy it. Sort of like Stephen, I enjoy the process of writing. I think the blank page, if you will, is a great challenge. I don't dread it, never have. Even I'll date myself. When I was back in high school, I used to write stuff. My sister used to say, "You have a magic typewriter," and so back in those, it wasn't even electric, you know. So those days, it's always been something exactly right, Ed. that's always been something I enjoy. And then over the years, I continued the writing and researching, which I'm sure, like Emily, led to a doctoral dissertation and writings beyond that, various books and the column, and doing teaching at UCLA in the Anderson School part-time, very much on a part-time basis in the MBA program, as well as consulting.
Well,
But
Ken, I invite you to consider using this medium as a launch for doing your advice column on a regular basis. And I'm very happy to co-produce it with you. Keep that in mind. We can always,
it sounds very, very
you know,
interesting. Thank
I mean,
you.
you just had to build my audience while building yours. It's sort of like what I call co-marketing.
Yeah.
And, it's a win-win if you do it right.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you. I think on
Thank
that.
you. Just an idea a minute here. Boy.
Oh, absolutely.
So Dr. Emily, tell us about your students. They're probably a diverse group, but are they all young?
They are predominantly younger, but not all. So just to provide a little bit of context, and I also have a book coming out with my co-author, Professor Julie Davies, where we're exploring human factors in the gig economy, human factors and worker well-being. So that's coming out and published by CRC Press and due out next year. But to answer your question, Ed, not all my students are young, but they are indeed also from a diverse range of backgrounds from all over the world, predominantly from India and China, as well as from across Europe as well. And I always say it's teaching students it's one part of my job, alongside the research that I do, but it's a part of my job that really brings great joy. And teaching, as I'm sure Ken will attest to as well, is a really important and noble endeavor, and it's an honor to have the opportunity to teach. And we also, as educators, can learn a lot from our students as well.
Isn't that interesting? And to hear you talk about the diversity, I mean, that's going to lead right into our topic here today, of course, but this is unscripted and unrehearsed. So stand by for spontaneity. So Stephen Howard is in my view, I don't mean to embarrass you at all, but in my view, a genius at putting words together that express what people have been thinking about. And he's coined a word called humany, which is like harmony. Stephen, will you take over, please?
Well, thanks, Ed. Genius is probably too much of an attribute, but thank anyway. I created the word humany. I combined the words human, humanity, and harmony. And my original thinking was thinking about leadership coming out of the pandemic, how it was going to change. I saw things already changing towards the tail end of the pandemic, and the need for leaders to create workplaces of well-being and harmony. And as I was researching and talking to people while I was writing the book and talked about what is harmony like in your workplace, and people typically laughed at me and said, there's no such thing as harmony. This is a workplace. And I said, well, why not? Why couldn't we bring harmony into the workplace? So that's what the Humany Leadership concept is about. The Humany Leadership book is all about. And now, as you know, I've extended the Humany concept into everyday life for people with one of my most recent books called Humany Mindset, which is talks about how we interact with one another and the need to change that so we can minimize the divisive societies in which we live globally. I mean, it's just not the United States, and it's not just political. It's everything is dividing us as societies. And so it's my attempt to get people on a bandwagon to reconsider how they interact with each other.
I'm going to ask you to display the covers and some other things in just a few minutes. But first, Dr. Emily Yarrow, what percentage of your students currently are female?
So the program that I run, which is a master's program in global human resource management, is disproportionately female students. So there, and that's fairly typical in that kind of program. Within the business school, it's more evenly split. But yes, certainly within human resource management programs, be that at the undergraduate or the postgraduate level, we do tend to see a disproportionate number of female students. I think what's interesting to note as well, and when we attend, for example, HR conferences, I recently returned from the HR Tech conference in Las Vegas, where I've been working on some research looking at automated hiring platforms and AI-powered solutions around hiring. But what's noticeable is really that we still see a sort of vertical gender gap and vertical gender segregation. So the higher up that you go within the HR function, if you will, is that there seem to be more men at the top of the profession. So it's almost a reverse in what we see in the classroom, in my experience, and in the UK context.
And finally, for this segment, how do you use Zoom or its brothers and sisters? Do you mix it in, or is it more hands-on, one-on-one in the classroom?
So we're a real combination. So of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic, all teaching was online because it had to be. In the post-pandemic context, we really use a hybrid approach. So most of our teaching, 90% of our teaching is in person. And there's so much to be said for that human interaction. But then there are also elements where we use Zoom or other comparable platforms. For example, I personally use Zoom for the one-on-one meetings with students, where actually sometimes they don't even switch their cameras on if they're talking about personal issues. So for the pastoral piece, actually that slight disconnect through not being together in person can encourage and make some students feel more comfortable. So really the approach is ad hoc and using technology when we think it will add most value.
So in the U.S., getting to the headline topic today, the need for new leadership thinking and doing, in the U.S., it's hot news just yesterday. Walmart, a giant retailer, is cutting back on DE&I and other companies, and I think it's as a result of the Supreme Court in the U.S. Going through its machinations. So how do you define inclusive leadership, and why is it important in today's workplace?
Yeah, thank you. And it's a great question. I think, with the example that you just mentioned from Walmart, I think unfortunately that's something that we are over the next months and years potentially going to see more of, that organizations are cutting what they're doing in the diversity, equality, and inclusion space. For me, really, when I think about and when I talk about inclusive leadership, I really think about a person's ability to effectively lead and inspire a diverse group of people, and really to ensure equality of opportunity for everybody within an organization. And I think really what inclusive leadership is about, and there are various definitions and ideas surrounding inclusive leadership, but it's really about thinking about how are the people in the organization made to feel. So we start thinking about things such as respect, equality of of treatment and valuing individuals for who they are, not just for the value that they may bring to the organization. And I think it's really about leadership that comes from a strong moral compass, and really being guided by egalitarian values as well.
Stephen, would you please, if you would like to show the front cover of Humany and the award, talk about the award that you were blessed with from the that association? Yeah, that one.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. And in this book, I talk a lot about inclusive leadership and the need for inclusive leadership. The award came from the Nonfiction Authors Association, so it's to me it's very rewarding to get an award from my peers, other nonfiction authors, and so in the review of the book they called it a book with a mission, which I do believe it is. It is a mission of mine to publicize this and to promote it. As I listen to Emily talking here, to me, inclusive leadership, there's one thing I almost never hear people talk about when we talk about inclusive leadership, and that's the importance of listening. Leaders need to listen to everybody, and it's hard. It's hard to listen sometimes to somebody if they talk too fast, or if they have an accent, or they come from a different culture, anything along those lines. And then, of course, the other part of inclusive that I always talk to the people I coach about is, how are you including the introverts? How are you including those quiet people who don't speak up in a meeting, and in doing so in a way that doesn't embarrass them, doesn't call them out? Don't say something like, geez, Mr. Lloyd, we haven't heard from you all day. What do you have to think? You know, that's the wrong way of calling them out. But to lead meetings in such a way that you get the quiet people and get their ideas out on the table and get them talking. And the last part of inclusive leadership, and I'll take this down because I know this burns up a lot of your bandwidth, Ed. I don't think people talk enough about inclusion when it comes to mental well-being. I know if I went to my boss and said, hey boss, you know, I was coaching a boys basketball team last night and I really hurt my lower back, and man, it's painful. I'm gonna go home a little early today and just rest, take some Advil. Typically my boss would say, yeah, I understand, go ahead. If I went to that same boss and said, hey, you know what, my brain is fried, I just can't think straight anymore, I'm gonna go home a little early, rest, take a nap. Typically the boss would tell me, Stephen, pull up your socks, get in the game, you know, work through it, don't be a weakling, don't be a wimp, that sort of thing. But we can't do that in today's world. Mental unwellness, I don't want to call it illness, but mental unwellness, when you're stressed, when you're full of anxiety, when you're maybe on the cusp of depression or something, needs to be understood, and leaders need to be inclusive in their thinking of how they're going to lead people, because research shows over 70% of the workforce has had some form of burnout in the last 18 months, and leaders don't know how to cope with that.
Whoa.
I think I would just add to that, if I may. I think you're absolutely spot on, Stephen, and I think the importance of active listening, and listening with heart and with compassion. So not just hearing what someone is telling you, but really taking that on board, and as a leader saying, how can I help? How can the organization support you? So I think that listening brings together, and active listening brings together so much of what we're talking about today.
Ken?
Yeah, it just excellent points all around. It's interesting, when I wrote my first edition of the performance appraisals book, I had a section on diversity. That's 15 years ago. To me, this is not and never was a fad or something, let's just try this and put it away, but rather an element of a company's culture and climate, certainly key components of leadership to truly practice it, not to follow something that has a label of DEI, because that's obviously taken on some political connotations as well, but rather honestly and from the heart, try to engage in managerial practices, behavioral practices that are open and engaging, demonstrating empathy, concern for our employees as individuals, respect and trust, and creating that as an overall work environment, rather than just talking about it or plugging it in once in a while, just like we'll plug in some other program, but rather it's much broader than that. It's really how we work. I had worked for one of my client companies. I joined them and stayed on board for 18 years. And we were the most diverse organization I had ever worked in or worked with. Not that we were actively seeking diversity, but it was just part of what we were. Let's get great people here. And you know what? It led to a totally diverse organization with people feeling safe, welcome, respected. They were learning and growing and advancing, regardless of any of the kinds of factors, race, color, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or anything else, neurodiversity as well. That was the emphasis, that was the focus, and it worked. And the company was very successful, as were the employees in it. Yes, Mr. Howard, I see your hand up. This reminds me of UCLA. Yeah, Steve.
Well, I was just wondering, you know, it's such human nature that we have to lead by our actions. Last week, I won't reveal too much here, but last week I was in the southern part of Massachusetts, right on the Rhode Island border, doing a one-day program for a pharmaceutical company that's headquartered in India, but has 3 major facilities in the United States. And the audience was about 7 US people and 10 expatriates from India. And as they walked in the room, all the Indians sat together and all the Americans sat together. And, you know, it just people are comfortable with that, even though they work in the same company. And they've been working together for over a year now, because actually this is a new facility that's going online next year. So this group is going to be the leaders of this new facility. And so I just before just after the morning coffee break, the first exercise I did, I said, okay, you two people from this table come over here, you two come over here, you two come over here. And obviously what I did is I moved the Americans and onto the other tables, and I made them do group exercise, and then they stayed there for the rest of the morning. So leaders just have to do that. I didn't point it out. I didn't make a comment about, hey, why you guys aren't mixing yourselves? Why aren't you doing this? I just led. And they followed my instructions, fortunately.
And that's
How young-
exactly the same in the lecture hall or in
Yeah.
classrooms as well. We see exactly the same phenomenon. Yeah.
How young were your students, Stephen? your people?
Mine were, I'd say, probably late 20s, like 28 on up to the older gentleman in the room was probably 50 or 52, something of that nature, a good baby boomer. So it was a pretty diverse age audience, and therefore difference in experience levels as well.
Females?
There were only 3. Now, I don't know. Again, I would suggest only because this is a manufacturing facility that has just finished construction a few months ago, and now they're bringing the equipment in and putting the lines in and testing it, and going through all the quality control checks, because they're making drugs for human consumption, either in hospitals or tablets over the prescription tablets as well. So I think because of that, right now, it's a mostly male-dominated leadership team. But I think as they bring on more people and start running things, they'll bring in more engineers and others on the female, hopefully, female workers as well, or female leaders.
I agree with Steve. Over the years, we're continuing to see more and more of that type of diversity. When I started teaching graduate MBA students, I would have a class of 50 to 60 individuals. There may have been 5 or 6 females, and this is in the 1970s. Now, teaching those classes, easily 50-50, or maybe, as Emily said, a little tipped more on the side of females. And as that translates into careers and in the workplace, I think we're seeing that balance because it's right, it makes sense, it's promoting the best people, the excellent individuals are advancing. That's what we're going to see. But it is quite a difference. when there were even comments about, oh, gee, there are 3 females in this class. That would be a point that would be discussed, if you can imagine that. And now here we are all these years later. It's
Ken, last year was the first time that more females were enrolled in MBA classes in the United States, or programs, I should say, than males.
Yep.
So I believe it's continued into this year as well. So
Absolutely.
the
And we'll see that
Interesting.
same transition in leadership, management, executive positions in organizations as well. And that's happening at the same time too.
So, Dr. Emily, regression.
Yes.
I'm, it's a fancy word. That means going back, right?
Going backwards, yeah.
Right. Okay. So relate that to what's going on, like with Walmart and other things, and who knows what's going to happen in the U.S. come January. But regression in equality, diversity, and inclusion. I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm going to be quiet. What role does inclusive leadership play in preventing regressions? What's inclusive leadership mean?
So when we spoke about inclusive leadership earlier, we were talking about leading a diverse group of people, listening to our colleagues, listening to employees, doing so with empathy and with heart. So when we're talking about potential regressions, inequality and diversity, what we really start to think about is, as Ken mentioned, some of the fantastic things that have been achieved over the last 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Positive improvements around inclusion in organizations and how people are treated in organizations. But particularly now, in what is a politically tumultuous period of time, not only in the US context, certainly in the UK as well, and in many other parts of the world, as we find ourselves in climate crisis, in a cost of living crisis. There is a real danger, and we're already seeing this, that companies will step back from initiatives that support diversity and inclusion, exactly like the Walmart example that you've already mentioned. So it's really thinking about how can we prevent things from going backwards in organizations. So from my own research and from research that's more widely available, what we know is the importance of also adaptive strategy making. So yes, thinking about long-term diversity and inclusion goals in an organization, but actually not just rigidly sticking to those goals and the set path, but actually strategy that also responds to external changes. We find ourselves in a VUCA context, a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world. So it's also about thinking about the regular assessment and reassessment of practices and policies in the organization to respond to changes, to ensure that we don't go backwards on the positive changes that have already been made.
So England, former colonial power, and
with the many huge problems with which that comes, and I think it's important for me to I think us as a panel to acknowledge our own positionality and in that as well. But yes.
Yeah, so the reverse now, you've opened up years and years and welcome people from those countries, including Indians and Chinese and others. It's such a diverse economy,
And that's a wonderful thing, and
it seems to work.
It's the right thing.
Yeah, right. What role did Brexit have any influence on that? I'm losing my, I don't know what to say other than the headline.
Sure. So I think, so I myself, I'm half British, half German. My mother is German. Brexit has had, there's the personal standpoint. There is the political views on this as well. And then there are the lived experiences of what we're seeing, for example, in the university and as academics around funding, for example. I personally, and these are my views, not necessarily the views of my employer or colleagues, but my view is that Brexit is a travesty. The European Union was started from ideas of peace and togetherness. And in the UK, extracting itself from that, I think is extraordinarily sad for us as people, as Europeans as well. But there are really deeply problematic consequences. For example, European students who used to come to the UK and pay EU students' fees now pay international fees, so a huge financial hit, which puts European students off universities in the UK. A lot of the policy making, we spent, you know, in excess of 12 years under a conservative government, as well as the devolved nations, of course, of Wales and Scotland, which has done incredible damage to social policies. And Brexit has had also a hugely negative impact on tariffs and imports and on small businesses. And I particularly worry about, and thankfully now we have a new Labour government. I worry about the impact on employment legislation and the protection of worker rights in the post-Brexit context.
Yeah. So do you see a rejoining pattern developing?
I remain ever hopeful, whether it is politically, legislatively possible. I don't know, but I remain hopeful because I think the UK would be a better and a stronger place as a part of Europe. For me personally, it's also really important to put across that the UK is a much better place for people coming from all over the world. That creates a much better world for all of us in so many ways.
So we're talking about business executives now, and let's zero in on what are some key strategies that executive leaders in business can use to create and communicate about the benefits of an inclusive culture within teams or within the companies or within the country. Start small.
Yeah, thank you. I think Ken mentioned earlier, you know, this idea of DEI labeling and putting a label on DEI, and I think that I completely agree with you, Ken. I think that's problematic, and it encourages behaviors that aren't necessarily in the spirit of inclusion, actually. And when we think about inclusion in organizations, it's also really so much about communication, rather than merely being a box ticking exercise. It's about thinking about shared values, doing morally the right thing, and not just doing something because it's good for business or because it's good for the bottom line, but doing something and having certain initiatives in place because it is morally the right thing to do. Now, to answer your question a bit more clearly around what can and should execs do, and you mentioned communication. For me, and I'm sure Stephen and Ken will both attest to this, so much of when we think about inclusion in organizations comes back to open communication and active listening. And it makes me think about Nancy Klein's wonderful book, Time to Think. And this idea of really listening to challenge assumptions and asking incisive questions to really hear what the people in the organization need to feel included and to experience a sense of belonging. So I think in terms of what execs should be doing is really more listening and asking.
One of the hottest topics in the US, and I would guess now, after listening to you for a few minutes now, that is same is in England, psychological safety, quote, in the workplaces, which means in office, remote, on assignment, and in the home, workplaces. So diverse, hybrid. Psychological safety. A lot, in my view, and I am really not educated in this at all, other than just learning about it. Psychological safety means feeling safe to be different. And feeling belonging. Can you explain what I'm trying to explain?
Was that a question for me? Sorry,
Yeah, yeah, I'm sorry. Yes.
Sure. So I think when we talk about psychological safety, for me, it's and this is something that actually a lot of students talk to me about when they ask about potential organizations that they might like to join when they graduate. It's for me, it's this idea of feeling safe enough, comfortable enough to bring your whole self to work and to be the true you in the workplace. Now, of course, different people have different expectations and desires in terms of what elements of their personal lives they want to bring to work, how they might do that for different groups of people. That will still look different as well. But for me personally, when we talk about psychological safety, it's about that context that provides us with a level of comfort and safety, that choice to bring your whole self to the workplace is there.
Stephen, I want your opinion and your words here about your view of this new form. That's your theme, new leadership.
Thanks, Ed. And I would echo everything Emily said. And and one caveat, obviously, and it's only because I'm coaching a person right now who has a person on their staff that they've had to write up, disciplinary write up, because that second person, the team member, has brought his whole self to the workplace, but unfortunately his whole self includes sexual innuendos and inappropriate comments to people. And he said, well, that's who I am. But you have to realize that that's not acceptable in today's society. So you can't just use that bring my whole self as a sounding board for doing anything you want, quite frankly. So I've had to coach this manager on how to deal with this individual. I'm not pessimistic about this drop in the DEI language, because I think most organizations are going to hire the best people they find anyway. I think what it'll do is it'll reduce the reporting of all this. I know when you fill out a job application in the United States, you have to indicate whether you're a veteran, a protected veteran, not a veteran. You have to indicate whether you have a disability. You have to indicate your gender. Some even ask sexual orientation. All this record keeping that people are going through. And I think in some ways there's going to be an upside to this, because I think in some instances there's a perception that a person has only been hired or was hired because of preferential, because they fit a certain quota. Now, when people get hired by companies, they're going to say, well, they must be good, they got hired on talent, not because we're filling a DEI quota. So, but on the other hand, the thing I am pessimistic about, particularly in the United States, I don't know enough about Europe. I think people with special needs. I think the one benefit of DEI has been the number of organizations that have gone out of their way to accommodate people who have special needs, whether they're in a wheelchair, they only can use one hand, they have any other type of disabilities that, they put in places so to make them welcome and to use the talents that they have, even though they may have some physical or maybe in a mental disability, a handicap. I'm not trying to be politically correct here, but I think that might go away. I think some companies won't take the time, take the investment to include those because it is difficult. It's rewarding, but it is difficult to include people when you have to do, certain things like make your aisleways wider to accommodate wheelchairs and stuff of that nature. Put in any of those kinds of things. So I think that will be the downside to this stepping away, this regression, as you said, from DEI will be unfortunate people with special needs.
Could I just make a brief
yes.
comment
Yeah.
on that as
Yeah,
well, Stephen?
please.
So in the UK context, we have what are called reasonable adjustments, and those are adjustments that employees or future employees can request from their employer, which the employer is then legally required to accommodate and make best adjustments. And actually, certainly in the UK context, and I can't speak to the US context at the moment, but what we know is that actually in our context here, that most of the reasonable adjustments actually don't take a lot of time or a lot of resource, but they have a profound positive effect on inclusion in the workforce. But I think that also has to be legislated for. And I think certainly in the US context, there is a lot of change and a lot of churn around how DEI and making adjustments in the workplace might be legislated. But I think certainly what we see here is that the benefit to employees is hugely positively disproportionate to the cost in financial terms to an organization.
Here in the US, it's called accommodation. Do you need accommodations? Anything accommodating. And I agree, there's a huge advantage, but I also believe there's a huge perception that it's too much like hard work. It's too much effort.
Absolutely. And that perception versus actual cost.
Exactly. And if it's not legislated, then it's going to be no. We can't be bothered with that. It's just too hard. So it's like everything else, a perception that is in society we need to change those perceptions. Much like we used to think it was okay to hire 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds and put them in factories and have them work 60-hour weeks. Well, we decided that that's not very humane way of running a business. It might be profitable, but it's not very humane.
Exactly, and I think that's where legislation plays such an important role, but also I think with DEI in organizations, we do need to move, and when we talk about inclusive leadership and positive role modeling and values and behaviors, that we really need to move beyond the mere compliance piece. So not just doing things because the law says you have to do them, but doing them because it's morally the right thing to do. And this touches on, and Ken, I'm sure you're very aware of the kind of the tensions in the scholarly literature around the social justice case versus the business case around DEI as well. But I think moving from mere compliance to really fostering organizational cultures that value inclusion and inclusive leadership.
Okay.
I totally agree. And you just mentioned the word modeling, and that's really important. We can talk about the importance of two-way communication and empathy and active listening and engaging employees. Fine to talk about it, but truly to engage in those behaviors so the employees see it, understand it, and learn from it. I'm going to take an example that occurred in this discussion. Ed asked a direct question to Emily about Brexit, okay? Emily did not waffle, did not skirt around it, did not sugarcoat it. We got an honest, clear answer and a very educational answer as well. I could see you in the classroom with students asking questions that you're not giving them just some pablum answer, but really getting into it and showing your concern, your interest, your thinking about it, and expressing real views and opinion. There's an authenticity that comes through. That type of behavior by an individual in a leadership position truly helps, particularly when we get into areas focused on inclusivity. To be honest, candid, clear, two-way communication, take questions, actively listen, but to be genuine and actually candid in presenting the kinds of thoughts that you have. Because I think we're used to something quite different from that, certainly in political kinds of responses. And those just do not generate or are not genuine. They don't lead to behaviors from those that are hearing it that are engaging and uplifting and motivational, but rather, it's just more talk as opposed to really actual bona fide communication. So Emily, you gave a great example of it, and thanks for your comments on Brexit. They're extremely interesting.
Thank you.
We have about 9 minutes left, so there's plenty of time. Oh boy. Stephen, you want to show the front covers of your new Humany book and also participating successfully?
Sure, happy to. That's the Humany Mindset. Actually, that's the second book. So the Humany Leadership was the first book. This is the one that is most recent, that talks about how we interact with each other, and the four core principles of a Humany Mindset is to interact with each other from a basis of peacefulness and trust and interaction. In here, the cover, which was designed by a Mexican designer, you've got the tree of life, which is in many religions and many Aboriginal stories. You have the tree of life in the brain there, and then in the arms is it looks like veins, but really that's the DNA double helix in the arms. And it goes to the point I wanted to make here about diversity in the workplace. And I've lived most of my adult life outside the United States. And, I've lived in Asia, I've lived in Australia, I've lived in Mexico, and I've traveled, throughout Europe and the Middle East and Africa as well. We have more in common with each other than differences. And that's why that's what this cover symbolizes, is that the DNA that we all have is about 98, 99% the same, basically. And so, I think one of the perception problems with the DEI movement was that it focused on diversity. And hopefully we could just turn it around and just focus on, hey, we're all human beings, and let's focus on what we have in common. And yeah, there might be some, there are some differences without a doubt. But instead of focusing on the differences, let's focus on our commonalities. And then let's, Emily used a great word, shared values. I mean, I'd rather hire a person who shares the same values that I do regarding work and regarding the type of work we're doing and regarding work-life harmony than to hire a person because they look like me or they talk like me or they have the same political beliefs as me or anything else. So focus on hiring based on those shared values, and you're going to end up with a diverse workforce that can work together and cooperate and collaborate together.
So on the book that you published with Ali about partnering successfully with American companies and U.S. business thinking, business executives, Emily, have you had issues, problems with dealing with Americans? It doesn't seem it to me that you would, but I have to ask the question as a lead into the next segment.
No,
Good.
not specifically. Prior to being in academia, I worked for Procter and Gamble, where actually I had the honor to work with people from all over the globe. And I think regardless of, I very much attest to the various things that Stephen has mentioned, around thinking about actually what brings us together as people rather than what drives us apart. But I think at the same time, and again, acknowledging my own positionality and my own privilege here, we need to remain aware of the privilege or disadvantages which have historically been ascribed to people from certain parts of the world or from certain groups. So it's about thinking about what brings us together, but at the same time we need to acknowledge privilege as well as difference. But in terms of coming back to your questions, have I encountered issues in working with Americans? No, I think whenever we're working across geographical boundaries, physical boundaries as well, organizational, cultural boundaries, it's about emotional intelligence and about relational intelligence and thinking about how we communicate, be that in English or any other language as well, and really going back to the piece about listening. There's a wonderful book by a wonderful scholar, Professor Les Back, the art of listening. And in the book, there is a lot about, again, this idea of not just hearing, but really processing what the person is trying to or is communicating. And sometimes indeed that can be lost in translation, or whether that's through jargon or different languages as such. What I would add as well, actually, is sometimes I think there's a misconception, and it's something that I certainly have been guilty of, that when we have a shared language, that we assume elements of a shared culture. Now, whilst to an extent that might be true, sometimes there can actually be wider cultural differences between, say, an organization in the UK and the US versus an organization in the UK and France, for example. So I think it's really more nuanced than just language and national cultural boundaries. There are more layers to that. But no, I've always found it a pleasure to work with and communicate with Americans, even though certain words might be lost, and you guys have sweaters and we have jumpers, for example.
Yes.
Just to tie into what Emily was saying, in addition to actively listening, to be as aware as we can of the nonverbal aspects of communication, pitch, tone, volume, physical actions. I can say, you did a good job. I can say, you did a good job, meaning somebody else, and you did a good job. You did a good job. I just changed it. That means you didn't do an excellent job. You did a good job. And it's any of these things. I can say, I like what you're saying. I like what you're saying. I like what you're saying. All of that impacts the meaning. So with active listening, it's listening, and just as you had said, to truly engage and make sure we're picking up all of the cues that are coming. That's where, frankly, while having these virtual meetings is not perfect in terms of picking up nonverbal cues, it's a lot better than a phone call, and it's better than if I just shut off my screen. So all of this counts in terms of our engaging with each other and communicating effectively and demonstrating those kinds of elements in our communication processes.
Ken, please show your front cover. And then,
I'm gonna do even more than that. I'm gonna show the front and the spine and the back.
oh, wow.
There you
Okay.
go. Let's see here.
That's a first time.
Did you get it?
Not yet, no.
Not yet? Why would you? Okay, let's see
You
why
gotta
it didn't.
push the right
show.
button.
Yeah, push
The
the.
cover's still under design.
Yeah, okay, hold on here. Let's go. Why is it fighting me? Don't fight me.
Screen share is open.
Yeah.
Let's see now.
I'll put one of mine up for you, Ken.
It's so funny because I do this at other meetings and never a problem. Somehow here with Ed, I don't want to waste anyone's time. So this is something going on with my system. So let's go back to our meeting, and it's a very pretty cover.
It's red. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
And red all over.
Yeah, I got a lot of red. Oh my goodness. All right. Well,
okay, Stephen, you want to show that book
if I brought
cover?
in my grandson, it would take 2 seconds and you'd see it. But, I'm very sorry.
No, it's okay.
Stephen,
I
put up
can.
another one of your 27 covers for us.
Here you go. Here you go, Ken. I'll put one up there for you. And it's fun because, as Emily says, we're the old phrase, the United States and England they're like sister countries, separated by a common language. And so in this book, Partnering Success with American Firms, Ollie and I included over 100 American idioms that people use in business, that people outside, and I've lived in Australia, for instance, and people in Australia wouldn't understand half of these things, like throw somebody under the bus, or he knocked it out of the ballpark or something. In Australia and England, they'd say he hit it for 6, which is a cricket term, and of course, in the United States, we say something along the lines of, well, he smacked that out of the ballpark, which is similar to hitting it for 6, but hitting it for what's called a home run in baseball. So, but that's a book we wrote for Emily, because we wrote it for the professors of the world in their MBA classes to teach students how to deal with American business firms. So you can put that in your reading list, Emily, for your students.
Thank you.
This has been great. Emily, thank you so much for sharing your self here
It's
with
my
us
absolute
for an
pleasure.
hour. Yeah, come back again.
I'd love to, and thank you so much, and thank you, Ken, and Stephen as well. It's been fantastic to be involved. Thank you.
Yeah,
Nice.
great.
Thanks
All
to
right.
all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I will go to work and send you the recording. It'll be a group, and then it will also be a close-up, Hollywood close-up on whoever is speaking. It's an integrated system here. Okay, thank you.
Thanks one and all. Be well, everybody.
Ciao.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.